Sagittarius. Something terrible is about to happen. They're crying in hell they will lose their life. Sagittarius, you were never meant to fight fire with fire. You were born to walk through burning chaos with the torch of divine light in your hands. And lately you may have felt something shifting. An unseen weight lifting. A silence settling in your spirit. That's not coincidence. That's karmic reversal. Something is happening behind you, collapsing not in your world but in theirs. The ones who once laughed at your pain, who thought your light was weakness, they are now crying, not from loss of you, but from losing themselves in a darkness they built with their own hands. You don't need to turn back. You don't need to prove anything. The universe remembers everything, your silence, your grace, the countless times you chose peace when you could have chosen rage. Sagittarius, you are not the reason for their pain. You are simply the mirror through which karma now reflects truth. And as we begin this sacred message together, take a breath. Feel your soul exhale. You made it. Not just through the fire but beyond it. If this message finds a place in your heart, I invite you to like this video, share it with someone who needs to remember their light, and subscribe to Zodiac Wisdom to walk this path with me. Because what's coming next is not an ending. It's a restoration. Gate 1. It's not you punishing them. It's the universe rebalancing. There's a moment in every Sagittarius life when the fire you carry begins to flicker. Not because you're weak, but because you've given too much light to people who mistook it for a flame to burn you. You know what I'm talking about. The ones who saw your warmth and tried to use it against you. The ones who confused your honesty for naivete. Who looked at your loyalty as an opportunity to manipulate. They laughed when you fell silent. They whispered when you walked away. But you never did it to punish them, you did it to preserve your soul. I once knew a Sagittarius woman named Elena. She was radiant in every room she entered. Not because she dressed to impress or demanded attention, but because her truth was undeniable. People felt safe around her. She had this way of listening that made you believe she could see right into your past and still choose to love you anyway. And yet, the very people who leaned on her light began to resent her for it. They accused her of being too intense, too much, too free. Eventually, her closest friends turned their backs on her in one of the most pivotal moments of her life. Right after she lost her father. I remember how she showed up at his funeral alone. Not one of them came. And still, she didn't say a single bitter word. Weeks passed, then months. She moved forward. Quietly. She started painting again, traveling, finding little joys that had once been eclipsed by heartbreak. And one by one, those same people began to unravel. Not dramatically, no flames, no crashing explosions. Just slowly. One lost a job unexpectedly. Another suffered a betrayal eerily similar to what they had once done to her. Another faced a sudden illness that no one could explain. Elena never gloated. She never said, "That's what you deserve." Instead, she told me, "I think life just rebalances itself when you stop trying to fix everything." Her peace didn't come from revenge. Came from release. Sagittarius, you've walked in similar shoes. You've carried pain in silence. You've questioned yourself thinking, was I too forgiving? Too passive? But you were never passive. You were wise enough to understand that not every battle is yours to fight. The people who once cheered your downfall are now wrestling with shadows of their own creation. And no, it's not because you wished them harm. In truth, you didn't even want justice, you just wanted peace. But the universe has a way of returning what was sent out. And now what's unfolding behind you is not cruelty. It's divine accounting. This isn't about being happy that they're hurting. It's about understanding that you are no longer tied to their chaos. When you stopped chasing closure, something powerful began. Karma doesn't always arrive in lightning bolts or loud consequences. Sometimes it shows up in quiet nights where someone can't sleep because of the weight they carry. Sometimes it's the inexplicable anxiety, the persistent failure, the sudden unraveling of the life they thought was untouchable. Sagittarius, your silence did not mean weakness. It meant mastery. Have you ever felt a shift inside? A moment where you suddenly didn't feel angry anymore, just free? That's when the energy began to return to you. That's when your spirit began to unhook from the patterns that once defined you. There are forces moving now, reordering the things you can't see. A coworker who once sabotaged you is now under scrutiny. A friend who dismissed your dreams is now facing her own sense of failure. The ex who blamed you for everything can't seem to find peace in any relationship since. And yet you feel calmer than ever. You're not imagining this. It's real. There's something sacred in letting go without needing applause, in choosing not to defend yourself and allowing your integrity to speak in your absence. A Sagittarius man I once worked with, Marcus, was a teacher, one of those rare souls who didn't just educate but inspired. His students adored him, but his colleagues? Not so much. They spread rumors, questioned his credentials, made him feel like a fraud. He nearly quit, but instead of retaliating, he focused on the kids, poured everything into helping them see their own brilliance. Years later, the truth surfaced. The department head who once humiliated him was caught in a funding scandal. The others faded into irrelevance. And Marcus? He became head of his own educational foundation. When I asked him how he stayed so grounded through it all, he said, "Because my dignity wasn't for sale." That's the heart of Sagittarius. You don't burn people. You outgrow them. And while they flail in the ashes of what they tried to ignite in you, you're out here planting seeds of joy, purpose, renewal. The reason their lives are unraveling isn't because you cursed them. It's because they built their comfort on your silence. And now that silence has become an echo that won't leave them alone. They laughed when you didn't defend yourself. But now they remember that laugh every time something goes wrong. And you? You remember nothing but the freedom of not caring anymore. This is not about bitterness. It's about recognition that the energy you gave so freely is now sacred, protected. Sagittarius, there's nothing wrong with being the one who walks away. Sometimes the strongest action is no action at all. The most powerful spell is detachment. The deepest healing comes not when others apologize, but when you stop needing them to. You're not cold. You're clear. You're not punishing them. You're purifying yourself. The chaos they now face is not your concern. It's their lesson, written in a language they refused to learn until it was too late. But you understood. Long before they knew what was coming, you were already rising. You might be asking yourself, why now? Why is everything crumbling for them while I'm finally starting to feel light again? Because timing is sacred. Because the universe moves in seasons, and the harvest of your pain is finally blooming into power. You are stepping into a chapter where you don't have to prove your worth anymore. Where you don't need to explain why you left, why you stayed silent, why you chose kindness when cruelty was expected. You are becoming a mirror to those who never expected to see themselves. And the reflection is terrifying, not because you're scary, but because your grace exposes everything they pretended not to be. They once called you intense. Now they realize you were just deep. They said you were too honest. Now they understand honesty was the only thing that could have saved them. But that window has closed. And you are not their rescue anymore. You are your own rebirth. Sagittarius, look at how far you've come without needing anyone to carry you. The storms they sent your way became the winds that lifted you. And now they're crying, not from regret but from recognition. The light they once took for granted is gone, not dimmed, removed. And what's left behind is a space they cannot fill, a silence they cannot understand, a peace that once belonged to you and now refuses to return. So if you feel lighter these days, know it's not random. The karmic weight you once carried for others is no longer yours. You are not their judge. You are not their jailer. You are simply the living proof that grace wins when rage is not chosen. Let them cry. Let them crumble. You, dear Sagittarius, just keep walking forward. Gate 2. The ending was never your failure. It was your freedom. There are moments in a Sagittarius life when everything seems to collapse without warning. Relationships dissolve, jobs fall through, people vanish without a word. And the first instinct, because your heart is so vast and open, is to wonder what you did wrong. You replay every conversation, every gesture, every moment of silence, searching for the mistake. But what if I told you that the ending wasn't your punishment? It was your release. Endings are not always fair. They rarely come with closure. But Sagittarius, you are a traveler not only of landscapes, but of emotional thresholds. You are one of the rare signs who can turn heartbreak into a map, who can look at a broken connection and say, "This will lead me somewhere greater." Still, that doesn't mean the loss doesn't hurt. And it especially hurts when the ending is not something you chose. I remember a Sagittarius man named Daniel. He had been with his partner for nearly 8 years. Their love had weathered family feuds, financial setbacks, and health scares. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Or so he thought. One day, without a fight, without a hint of warning, his partner left. A single note on the table. "I need a different life." That was it. Daniel collapsed, not outwardly but inside. He continued to go to work, to smile at friends, but when he went home, the silence was unbearable. He began to believe it was his fault. Too ambitious, too restless, too hard to love. Until one night, he sat on the floor, wrapped in a blanket, and asked the question out loud. Why wasn't I enough? And that night, for the first time, instead of blaming himself, he heard a different answer. You were never meant to stay in a place that couldn't grow with you. It wasn't divine thunder, no voice in the sky. It was his own voice, rising from deep within his soul. The Sagittarius voice, the one that always knows when a door has closed, not to punish, but to reroute. Sagittarius, you have lived this. You've poured yourself into people, into places, into dreams that suddenly disappeared. And the void they left felt like failure. But look deeper. The endings you didn't choose are the very ones that protected you from wasting more of your sacred fire. The betrayal was cruel. The abandonment was cowardly. But the release? That was divine. When something is ripped from your life, it's natural to grieve not just what was lost, but what could have been. The wedding that never happened. The child never born. The promotion that went to someone else. But Sagittarius, grief is sacred. And you, more than most, know how to walk with it. Not rush it. Not deny it. But walk with it, the way you've walked through forests and valleys and cities unknown. Grief doesn't stop your journey. It sharpens your compass. There's a woman I once worked with, Maya, also Sagittarius. She was a brilliant graphic designer, endlessly creative, always dreaming. One day, after 3 years of building her dream team, her business partner blindsided her. Froze the accounts, shut her out of the company they had built together. She had nothing but a laptop and a list of unpaid invoices. For weeks, she was paralyzed with confusion. How could someone she trusted so deeply betray her like that? But Sagittarius, as you know in your soul, fire doesn't die in ashes. It reignites. Maya moved across the country, took a year to paint, started offering creative retreats for women healing from burnout. Today, she owns a studio where art meets emotional healing. And she often says that the betrayal was the blessing she didn't want but ultimately needed. He didn't ruin me, she told me once, eyes glowing. He redirected me to myself. And that's what every ending really does. It peels away what was no longer in alignment with your soul. Sagittarius, your heart is built for meaning, for purpose, for expansion. And anything that tries to limit that will eventually dissolve, no matter how tightly you cling to it. That's not punishment. That's cosmic mercy. But let's talk about the in-between. The space after something ends but before the next beginning shows up. That's the valley no one prepares you for. It's where doubt creeps in, where memories play like old films on repeat, where you begin to ask questions that feel like accusations. Was I too free-spirited? Did I ask for too much truth? Was I wrong to believe in them? Sagittarius, I need you to know this. You were not wrong to believe. You were simply ahead of the timeline. You were living at a depth others hadn't yet reached. The end was their choice. But your healing, that's your power. You see, every time something left your life, something else tried to enter. More space, more insight, more self-respect. But grief often builds a wall so thick we can't feel the new light trying to shine in. That's why endings feel so lonely. Because you are not just mourning the person or situation, you are mourning the version of yourself that loved them. And still, there is something sacred in that mourning. Because Sagittarius, when you let go of what could have been, you make space for what was always meant to be. The people who left, they did not destroy your worth. The opportunities that passed you by, they weren't meant to carry your soul to its destination. The loss did not break you. It revealed you. Do you feel it now? That subtle strength inside you? The one that isn't loud or dramatic but steady, like a flame that refuses to go out. That is your spirit coming home. Not to the past, but to your future. And the ones who left will never see it coming. They expected you to collapse, but you expanded. They expected you to shrink, but your laughter returned. They expected you to chase them, but you chose yourself. Let me say this clearly so you can hear it not just with your ears, but with your heart. The people who let you go were not your home. They were your lesson. They were the last chapter in a book that needed to close so a more sacred one could begin. And you are not defined by their departure. You are defined by your return to yourself. There's a saying I love. When people show you who they are, believe them. But I think for Sagittarius, the truer version is this. When people leave you, believe the universe. Because the stars have always been conspiring to bring you back to truth. Even if it hurt. You weren't rejected. You were redirected. And now you're stronger, quieter, more luminous. So don't rush to replace what's gone. Let the silence stretch. Let the space speak. Let your soul breathe in this newness. Because what's being created inside you now is nothing short of holy. The person you're becoming wouldn't have survived in the life you lost. And that, dear Sagittarius, is why the ending had to come, because your future was too bright for where you were. And as we continue, I want you to carry this one thought forward. Not all losses are tragedies. Some are recalibrations. Some are sacred severings. Some are the hand of God removing what your spirit no longer recognized as home. You didn't fail. You didn't fall. You were freed. Gate 3: the bonds that survived the fire. Spiritual love and soul connections. There are kinds of love, Sagittarius, that don't disappear when people do. The kind of love that stays alive even after betrayal, silence, or years without contact. The kind that you can't explain to others because it wasn't built on logic or consistency, but on something older, more eternal. You felt it before. Maybe you're feeling it now. A bond so deep that even after it was broken, it kept whispering in your bones. Not to return, but to remember. Spiritual love isn't always sweet. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in chaos. Sometimes the one your soul recognized was the same one who taught you what it means to be completely undone. And yet, somehow that undoing made you whole again. There was a Sagittarius woman I once knew. Her name was Laurel. She met a man during a summer she never planned for. They were both traveling, both heart-weary from failed relationships. It wasn't love at first sight. It was recognition. Like two stars finally remembering their orbit. They only had 3 months. They didn't promise forever. But Laurel said it was the most real connection she'd ever known. He listened to her poetry without flinching. She sat with his grief without fixing it. They didn't try to possess each other. They just witnessed. And when it ended, it wasn't because of betrayal. It was time. They lived on opposite sides of the world. He had children. She had dreams that needed solitude. But the bond? It never died. Years later, on the night her mother passed away, she received a letter. I don't know why, it read. But I felt your heart crying. Just know I still carry you. There was no return address. Sagittarius, not every love is meant to stay. Some are meant to awaken. These are the soul contracts that ignite you in a way you can't undo. The ones that teach you not how to hold on, but how to let go with reverence. And you, more than anyone, have carried these sacred loves in silence. You don't always speak of them, but they live in your gaze, in the way your voice softens when a certain song plays, in the letters you wrote but never sent. You know spiritual love by its aftermath. It's not the passion that matters, it's the transformation, the person you became after them, the fire they lit in your heart that continued to burn even after they walked away, the way they held a mirror to your soul, and for the first time you saw who you truly were. Not just a lover but a force of nature. Not just a giver, but a guardian of something timeless. Sometimes that love returns, and sometimes it doesn't. But either way, it never leaves empty-handed. Changes you. It plants something inside you. A kind of faith that outlives disappointment. And that's where your deepest strength comes from, Sagittarius. You love knowing it might break you. You leap anyway. And yes, sometimes you leapt into arms that didn't know how to hold you. Sometimes your love was met with confusion, fear, or even cruelty. But you loved anyway. Not because you were foolish, but because you were free. Your soul came here to feel deeply, to love wildly, to let truth burn through illusion. And that's what you've done, even when it left you in pieces. I remember a Sagittarius man, Ben, who fell in love with a woman already promised to someone else. They never crossed a line, not physically, but emotionally. They went to places even marriage couldn't reach. He knew he wasn't hers to keep, but still, he showed up for her during her father's funeral, stood at the very back of the church, left flowers at the door, and vanished before she could see him. When I asked him why he kept loving someone who couldn't choose him, he said, "Because love isn't a contract. It's a gift. And I gave it freely." That's what spiritual love is. A gift. Sometimes invisible but never forgotten. And Sagittarius, you've given it more times than you realize. You've shown up for people who never had the words to thank you. You've lit candles in the hearts of strangers without expecting anything in return. And some of those souls, they remember. Even if they never said so. Even if they couldn't stay. Your love became a compass they now carry through their own darkness. You see, what others called intensity was your intuition. What they named too much was your soul recognizing its own. But most people aren't ready for love that doesn't ask for permission to exist. Most people haven't yet learned how to hold something sacred without trying to own it. And that's why so many ran. They weren't running from you. They were running from what you awakened in them. Because love like yours isn't comfortable. It's illuminating. It exposes the shadows. And not everyone is ready to see what still lives in their own. But you are. You always have been. And now, you're beginning to understand that spiritual love doesn't always end with forever. Sometimes it ends with thank you. Sometimes it ends in silence. And that silence becomes holy. Sagittarius, maybe someone left without explanation. Maybe a connection ended and you never got your questions answered. But here's the truth. You don't need their apology to heal. You don't need their return to feel whole. The bond is still real. The love is still sacred. But it no longer controls you. That's the beauty of soul growth. You begin to remember that you were the miracle all along. You may wonder, will I ever love again like that? And the answer is yes, but differently. Deeper. With more discernment. With a heart that has been burned but not broken. A heart that knows its worth not from what it receives, but from what it gives without losing itself. And the love that's coming into your life next? It won't need to be convinced of your value. It will see you and stay. Because now your soul is sending out a different signal. Not one of yearning, but of embodiment. Not one of searching, but of standing. You are no longer calling in mirrors of your wounds. You are calling in reflections of your healing. The ones who come now will not ask you to shrink. They will ask to meet you where you are. In the fullness of your light, the clarity of your vision, the fire of your truth. And until that love arrives, if it hasn't already, know this. You are not unloved. You are surrounded by ancestors, by guides, by unseen hands that have carried you through every heartbreak. The reason you feel watched over lately? You are. The reason your dreams have been vivid, your instincts sharper? It's because your soul is tuning in again to the higher frequency of love, the one that never ends even when people do. You are not just healing. You are remembering that your love has always been sacred, that your heart has always been holy, that your presence alone changes lives. You didn't need a partner to prove that. You didn't need a happy ending to validate it. You only needed time to see it for yourself. And now that you do, Sagittarius, your heart will never settle for less again. Date for the quiet awakening. You are no longer in the fire. You are the light it left behind. There comes a time in the journey of a Sagittarius soul when the pain no longer burns, not because it never existed, but because you have become something greater than what hurt you. You've stopped asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and started whispering, "What is this trying to teach me?" That shift, that quiet but irreversible shift, is the beginning of awakening. Not the kind that arrives in thunder and visions, but the one that creeps in through a whisper on a sleepless night, through the gentleness you offer yourself when no one else is watching. It's the moment you stop trying to escape the past and start remembering that it never defined you, only refined you. Sagittarius, you are the fire sign that doesn't burn to destroy but to illuminate. Your awakening was never loud because your healing happened in the shadows. You carried yourself through nights where no one checked in, through tears that left no evidence. You buried so many dreams, held so many truths in silence, and still showed up every day as if your soul hadn't cracked open the night before. That wasn't weakness. That was sacred strength. I once spoke with a Sagittarius elder named Jonah, who told me something I never forgot. He said, "I spent 40 years trying to prove I was unbreakable, and it only worked when I finally let myself be broken." There's something holy about falling apart in the right way. the way that strips away pride, denial, and pretending. The kind of fall that leaves you empty enough for truth to enter. Sagittarius, you've done that. And because of it, you are now walking with a wisdom that doesn't shout. It just glows. Do you notice how animals respond to you more lately? How strangers open up without knowing why? How the world seems quieter around you, yet more alive? That is not coincidence. That is resonance. Your energy has changed. You are no longer vibrating at the frequency of survival. You are radiating peace. And people feel it even if they can't name it. Even if they don't deserve to stand near it. You've become a sanctuary, Sagittarius. A resting place for those who are still learning how to breathe. And it's not because you healed perfectly. It's because you chose not to let pain turn you into someone else. You remain tender. And that tenderness is your power. You walk softly now, not out of fear but out of reverence. For yourself, for your journey. For the quiet knowing that you are being watched over in ways you can't always see. There is a force that has followed you through every storm, Sagittarius. Call it God, the universe, divine intelligence, it doesn't matter. It has no name because it exists beyond language. But you felt it. In the way your heart slowed when you needed calm. In the song that played when you were ready to give up. In the stranger's smile that reminded you the world isn't all cruel. These are not accidents. They are the language of spiritual protection. The signs that something has always had your back. Even when no one else did. I once met a woman named Esther, a Sagittarius in her 70s, who told me that every time she was about to fall into despair, a hummingbird would appear near her window. Not once. Every time. For years. During divorce. During her cancer diagnosis. Even on the morning of her sister's passing. She said, "I think it's God's way of saying, you're not alone, little flame. Keep going." And she did. She kept going. And the hummingbirds kept showing up. Sagittarius, you have your own hummingbirds. Maybe not in winged form but in synchronicities. In numbers. In dreams. In feelings that suddenly pull you away from something that wasn't meant for you. And lately you've become more aware of them. That's no accident either. That's because you've reached the point in your soul's journey where protection is no longer reactive. It's proactive. You are being steered now, not just saved. Guided, not just guarded. You may have noticed a strange peace in the middle of situations that would have wrecked you before. That's because you're no longer tied to old karmic cycles. The cords that once bound you to certain people, patterns, and pains have been quietly cut. Not through force but through frequency. You outgrew them, Sagittarius. And as you did, the spiritual realm began to open new doors. Ones that don't slam shut in your face, but open at the touch of your breath. You don't have to prove yourself to enter anymore. You simply walk through. That is what spiritual maturity looks like. That is what awakening truly is. It's not about floating above the world. It's about finally being able to walk through it with grace. Without absorbing every wound. Without losing your light every time someone else is lost. You used to try to save everyone, didn't you? Thinking if you just loved them more, gave them more, they'd stay. But now you understand. Some people are not meant to be rescued. Some are meant to be released. And your healing is no longer measured by who you can fix, but by what you can finally let go of. That ex who keeps appearing in your memories? Their hold is fading. That old friend who drained your spirit? You no longer feel guilty for stepping back. That version of yourself who tried so hard to belong, to be understood, to be chosen? You are gently laying her to rest. Not in bitterness. In peace. And what is replacing all that noise is a stillness that is not empty, but full. Full of clarity, of knowing, of trust. You don't have all the answers, Sagittarius. But you no longer need them. Because something in you has shifted from needing to understand to simply choosing to trust. And that trust? That's the real armor. Not the walls you once built to keep pain out, but the light you now carry that dissolves darkness before it even reaches you. You may have days where grief returns, where the old fears knock on your door, but you no longer answer with panic. You greet them like old ghosts who no longer scare you. You smile. You say, "I remember you, but I live here now." Not you. And they leave. Sagittarius, this is the age of your soul where you become a guide. Not because you have all the wisdom, but because you've walked through enough fire to know what burns and what purifies. You don't speak from theory. You speak from truth. And that truth lives not in your words but in your presence. People are watching you now, not with judgment but with reverence, wondering how you still laugh after all that loss, how you still believe after all that betrayal, how you still love with that same wild sincerity. And the answer, though you rarely say it, is simple: because you've met your soul. And once you've done that, nothing external can ever take you away from yourself again. So keep walking, Sagittarius. Not faster, not louder, just truer. The ground beneath you is sacred, not because it is easy but because it is yours. And as you move forward, know this: the worst is behind you, not because harm will never come again, but because you now know how to rise from it, how to protect your peace, how to recognize the divine in the smallest things. The fire no longer surrounds you. It lives inside you now, not to destroy, but to remind that you, dear Sagittarius, are the light that remains after the world has burned. Conclusion: you were never the fire they feared. You were the light they couldn't dim. Sagittarius, if you've made it this far, then you already know this wasn't a story about punishment. It was a story about power. Not the loud kind that seeks revenge, but the quiet, sovereign kind that comes from surviving without losing your soul. The kind of power that knows when to walk away, when to say nothing, and when to trust the timing of the universe over the noise of the world. You've walked through endings you didn't choose, held love that couldn't stay, and carried truths that no one saw but you. And still you didn't collapse. You transformed. You became a mirror that reflects truth, a sanctuary for those who are still learning how to breathe, a light that burns from within, not to prove but to illuminate. You didn't lose. You led. Not because you were perfect but because you refused to let pain define your path. This is not the end of your story. This is the beginning of your rise. You are not just someone who survived betrayal, heartbreak, and abandonment. You are someone who alchemized it into grace. The ones who once underestimated you are not your concern anymore. Let karma do its quiet work. Your job now is to live fully, loudly, joyfully. So breathe, Sagittarius. You've earned this peace. You've earned this freedom. And as you continue forward, let your walk be soft, your words few, and your light unapologetically bright. If this message touched something sacred in you, I invite you to like this video, share it with someone whose soul needs a reminder of its strength, and subscribe to Zodiac Wisdom. Together we'll keep walking toward truth, toward healing, and toward the kind of love that begins with you. You were never lost, Sagittarius. You were only becoming.